can get going. All right, so I just want to welcome everyone to this Accessible Trails discussion. I do want to let you know that the conversation tonight is being recorded so we can share it out to all the folks who've RSVP'd and could not be here tonight. I also wanted to let you know that we do have the opportunity for closed captioning if you need that or would like to have it. You can enable that at the bottom of your Zoom window by clicking Live Transcript and then Show Subtitles. So again, thank you for joining this Accessible Trails discussion. I'm Mariah Fogg, the Community Conservation Manager for the Berkshire Natural Resources Council, and I'm joined tonight by two coworkers, Mackenzie Greer, Director of Community Programs, and Charlotte Hood, who is off screen doing some behind the scenes reporting or supporting, and she is our volunteer and outreach assistant. So before passing the mic over, I'd like to share that is with gratitude and humility that we acknowledge that we are learning, speaking, and gathering on the ancestral homelands of the Mohican people, who are the indigenous peoples of this land. Despite tremendous hardship in being forced from here, today their community resides in Wisconsin and is known as the Stockbridge-Munsee community. And we pay honor and respect to their ancestors past and present as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. And to learn more about the Mohican Nation, you can visit mohican.com. I've learned that the chat is disabled, unfortunately, but please give thought to the native land that you are zooming in from. And now I'll pass it over to Mackenzie.
Okay, thanks, Mariah. I just wanted to welcome everyone here. We wanted to share a little bit of background about why we began doing this work and developing this program. In 2018, Berkshire Natural Resources Council, a regional land trust working throughout Berkshire County, opened a very special trail. We were really thrilled to open what was an accessible trail at the Parsons Marsh Reserve in Lenox. It was the first such trail that our organization had developed and built. And it was really exciting because we had massive community support, an exceptional design, and just a really perfect setting. The press release for the trail opening garnered a lot of attention. We were almost perplexed that folks from Albany were calling for more information about visiting just to experience this one trail. And importantly, as we went about our work of stewarding this trail and the landscape, we learned a few things. First, we had so much more to learn about accessible trails. And second, there was a need for more accessible woodland trails in our community and well beyond. So over time, we worked to develop deeper partnerships to learn more about stewarding these vital resources. And we realized that we had a role in sharing information about developing accessible trails with folks like you who are all here today, and in helping people find those trails. So this online sharing and learning program tonight is a direct result of these partnerships. We're so grateful to our experts and to all of you who are here to learn more along with us. As well, we're pleased to share that BNRC's new Accessible Trails brochure, Berkshire County Trails for All, will be released this coming weekend. And Mariah, perhaps I can put a link to that event in our chat so everyone can take a look at that. This evening's program is part one of a two-part online learning opportunity. So later this winter, or this coming winter, we'll expand the topic to focus on accessible trail building, modification, maintenance, a really important topic, and funding. So stay tuned for more information. We'll be sharing this around to everyone who registered.
Great. Thank you so much, Mackenzie. So now I have the honor of introducing our speakers this evening. First, we have Meg Bandarra, who is a nature lover, landscape painter, and an accessibility advocate. She's the founder of Unpaved Trails for All, an organization that educates about the importance of accessible, soft surface nature trails and campaigns for more of these spaces in Massachusetts. Meg is also a consultant on trail projects for the state, municipal, and nonprofit organizations in the New England region, and is also a recent member of the Massachusetts Recreational Trail Advisory Board. For more information about her advocacy work and the importance of accessible unpaved trails, visit unpavedtrailsforall.org. And then we have Marcy Marchello, who is a Universal Access Recreation Manager for the Department of Conservation and Recreation in Massachusetts, and has coordinated adaptive recreation opportunities statewide and year-round for over 25 years. She has assessed a number or numerous accessible trails in Massachusetts, both within and outside of DCR. And Marcy is currently working on developing an accessible wayfinding system for accessible trails in DCR. Before passing it over, I just wanted to share, we do have a dedicated Q&A session towards the end of the discussion tonight. We have a few guided topics, the importance of accessible trails, considerations for wayfinding and information sharing, and then where to find trails. So first, we'll hear from Meg on the importance of accessible trails. And I'll pass it over to you, Meg.
Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be here, and I'm really pleased that so many people have interest in this topic. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and show you a few things about accessible trails. All right. So when I think about why accessible unpaved trails are important, there are kind of three things that come to mind for me with that. The first two are the
Meg,
equity. Yeah.
I'll just share, your screen is not being shared at the moment.
Oh, okay.
I don't
Good
know
to
if
know.
that,
Very
yeah.
good to know. Well, let's see. Worked perfectly before.
I know, that's how it always goes.
Right. All right, let's see what we can do about that here. How about now?
Much better. Thank you.
Excellent. Great. So let me start back at the beginning. When I think about why trails, accessible unpaved trails are important, there are three things that come to mind for me. The first are equity and environmental justice. So access to nature for people with disabling conditions, which is a historically and still currently marginalized population group, hasn't really been something that's existed before. It's a relatively recent thing that accessible unpaved trails even exist. And outdoor recreation in general has been something that for people with disabling conditions just hasn't really been part of the equation, hasn't really been something that's been talked about a lot. And when we're talking about trails, we're often talking about public space, public land. And so we're talking about equity in terms of civil rights. And we're also talking about something that I think goes beyond civil rights, which is human rights. I think it's a human right to have access to nature. And we want to be sure that our natural space better reflects our population. I think that should be a goal for us in Massachusetts, and to do that in a way that's equitable. So I want to talk about the population of Massachusetts for a little bit. There are three groups of people that I think can benefit from accessible unpaved trails: folks with disabling conditions, seniors, and children under 5, because their family or caregiver family member or caregiver might be using a stroller or a carrier. Toddlers actually have limited mobility. When you think about it, they are unsteady on their feet. They can't walk very far. And when you take all three of these cohorts and put them together, that comes out to 33 to 47% of the population, which altogether, that's a pretty huge number. Up to 25% of the population alone in Massachusetts is under age 65 and has a disabling condition. And then 17% of the population are seniors over age 65. So that's a huge portion of the population. But those numbers vary throughout the state, and you can actually take that same census data and CDC and Massachusetts Commission for the Status of Persons with Disabilities, which is a mouthful. You can take that same data and look at it on a county level, and even in some cases a municipal level. And so because this is BNRC, I brought the numbers for Berkshire County, and Berkshire County is even higher, 41 to 54%. But I put possibly higher underneath that number because unfortunately, the numbers for people who are under age 65 with a disabling condition aren't that accurate often. And so it's kind of a best guess, and even at the state level. And when you get to a county level, you're sort of guessing a little bit more. And the other data surrounding that is pretty high for Berkshire County. And it leads me to believe that that number could be over 25%, but I don't have anything concrete to show for it. So I've put 54%, but I have a suspicion that it could be higher. And so with these numbers, it's not hard to see that when there's typically only a few trails or maybe no trails near you that are accessible, that right now we're not really meeting the needs of the population that we have right now. So that's, you know, a huge reason to me why these trails are so important. But also, everybody here knows that green space is healthy space. It's physically healthy, mentally healthy. And when you have a large portion of green space that's inaccessible, like in the city that I live in, we have a goal in my city of 25% of land being under conservation status. But right now my city doesn't have an accessible unpaved trail. So that's 25% of the land in the city that would be inaccessible to me and is inaccessible to me right now. So when we're talking about these healthy spaces, it's also really important for people with disabling conditions. And the benefits that we all know that green space have are extra important for people with disabling conditions. And I'll sort of talk about that a little bit more in a slide that's coming. But the rest of the population is also a segment of trail users that enjoy accessible trails, because accessible trails provide convenient and casual access to nature because they're wider and they tend to be better maintained. They offer less risk of tick exposure. And a lot of people look for that. And so I've kind of done like an informal survey where I've gone and just visited a bunch of trails just to see how populated and how busy they are. And consistently where I live, the accessible unpaved trails are the most popular with all types of trail users. And that's something that I see over and over again. And I think that goes back to that kind of convenient and casual access to nature. If you don't have a mobility consideration, they're just nice spaces. But then there's also a portion of the population that's hard to quantify, but I think it's important, particularly where we've been in the last few years. The illness and injury recovery population. There's no data that says exactly how many people are, you know, in that segment at any given time, but that's a real group of people that can benefit from these spaces and desperately need those spaces to help them recover. So it's a portion of the population that I think often goes unnoticed because they can't be easily quantified, but I like to mention it because it's a very real thing. And then the last portion of the reason I think that these trails are so important, I said there was 3 reasons. This is the last one, public health. So I touched on it a little bit, that public health is, we all know that green space and nature space is tied to public health, but it's especially important for people with disabling conditions. Studies have shown that all green space isn't actually created equal. And the newest studies, you know, the studies that we all sort of who are working in land conservation and getting more trails and wanting more green space, we often refer to the studies that say, this is healthy space physically and mentally. It's so important. It came up over and over during the pandemic. And the newest studies are really showing that green space, the less built it feels, so the less sort of built up elements, pavement being one of those things, the more stress relief we actually feel when we're in those spaces, as compared to a space that has more built elements. We still get benefits, but we actually feel less stress relief. And those are from studies in Japan and Norway, and also a study that was done by the Indiana University's School of Public Health, and in partnership with the School of Kinesiology and Recreation in Illinois State University. And they did really measurable and sort of asking people how they felt in an environment, and came up at the end of the study with the results that, yeah, you do feel more stress relief when you're in a space that feels more natural. But I think even just when I think about my own trail experience, I know that makes a difference. The way that I feel when I'm in a park or even on a bike trail, which is beautiful and lovely, is just different than the way that I feel when I'm in a space that feels truly like a natural space. And I think that's really important for me and for other people with disabling conditions, because we are far more likely, if your mobility is limited, you're far more likely to suffer from stress-related illnesses than your non-mobility limited peers. And as a whole population, people with disabling conditions score lower on quality of life and standard of living measurements. And we know that being out in nature can help with that quality of life portion of that unfortunate statistic. And so these trails are really, really important spaces. But at the end of the day, the kind of short answer to that is that they're everyone's spaces, and they're multi-generational, multi-ability. They provide health and well-being benefits for everybody. And it's kind of beautiful to be out on an accessible or an all-persons trail and see that multi-ability group of people, see that multi-age group of people. It's a really lovely thing. So I've kind of hit you with a lot of statistics and data about why they're important. So I want to kind of wrap things up on a more personal note. So if you think about sort of a non-accessible trail, it's a beautiful space, and you can say that, yes, people are absolutely getting health benefits and they're getting enjoyment and recreation from that space. But I think it's hard to say that any one particular trail is life-changing. But when you get to an accessible unpaved trail, you can for sure say that that trail is life-changing. I absolutely know it because they have changed my life. And if you build an accessible trail, they will absolutely change somebody's life. So for me, it's hard to put into words, I think, exactly how it feels when you can't access nature anymore. I think everybody probably takes it for granted a little bit when they don't have to think about how they access it. I know that I did before I acquired my mobility limitation. I didn't have to think about how I got into nature. I just went, and it was great. And I didn't really understand how incomplete your life feels when you can't just do that anymore, and how unbalanced it feels. And for me, being back out on a trail in the middle of the woods with my device was hugely important. It improved my physical and mental health for sure. It put everything sort of back into a better balance in my life, but it also gave me a new career. I became a landscape painter because I felt such a deep connection to nature when I was removed from it and was able to go back into it with an accessible trail. And that's the reason that I advocate for trails, because I know the life-changing potential of it, and we just don't have enough of them. And I think somebody, and a lot of people are now saying like these spaces matter, and really telling the story about why they matter so much and about just how impactful they are. Like if you build a trail like this, you will absolutely change people's lives with it. And I can't really think of kind of anything better that you could say about a trail at the end of the day. So I think that is mostly it for me. I'm going to share my contact information and my website, unpavedtrailsforall.org. My email is up there if you have any questions or anything. I know BNRC will handle questions from this webinar, but you can also feel free to send me an email. And we're on Instagram, yay. And that's Unpaved Trails 4 with the number 4 all. All right, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Meg, for that lovely presentation and sharing your personal experience as well. Marcy, before we move on to your dedicated topic, I just wondered if you had anything you would like to add on the discussion of the importance of accessible trails, though I'm sure there's a lot of blending in what you're going to talk about already.
Well, thanks. I do have one thing to throw in discussing the other users who benefit from accessible trails. I mean, you kind of open that door to everybody, Meg, but it struck me in your list that families and groups are really key also, because, for instance, I have an aging mom and a brother with a disability, and when I go hiking, I go where I go, but then when I go out with them, we go to those accessible experiences, right? So there's a lot of people who are enjoying those trails in that category too, because they're associated with someone who has a disability, who's aging.
Yeah. I mean, for me personally, it's one component of my life that changed a lot when I acquired my disability is my social life, because a lot of the way I socialized with friends was outdoor recreation. And so that changed for me a lot. And these spaces are that space where I can socialize with somebody outdoors. We can both be there. We can both navigate the space. So it's a really wonderful thing. It really is.
Yeah, be able to share the experience with others. Definitely. Yeah, thank you for sharing your personal side of this too. It's so meaningful to hear that after all these years of working in this field. So thanks.
Yeah, well, thank you.
All right, so at this time, we'll move on to our second topic and hear from Marcy about the considerations for wayfinding and information sharing. And of course, Meg, we'll have some time at the end if you want to tag along anything to Marcy's presentation.
Okay. It seems like we're ahead of schedule. So
We
I'm
are
wondering,
a little
I
bit.
have some liberties to not just rush my presentation. That would be great.
Absolutely. Take those liberties.
Okay, awesome. All right, so let me get this set up. Can people see this first slide?
Yes.
Can everyone see that? Okay. So, this part of the presentation is a bit oriented towards people who are building trails or managing land with trails or promoting trails. And I want to say that when we start that accessible trails discussion, it's very common to focus on how do you build this trail. And I'm so glad that we're giving this space to talk about the wayfinding early on in your double presentation opportunity, because equal consideration should be given to wayfinding as to constructing the trail. If you don't promote your trail, people aren't going to find out about it as easily, and therefore many people may never find out about it. So this is a really key piece. I've listed some categories I'm going to cover on the right-hand side here. And I'm going to in this slide, I'm just going to give some key points about each one of these, and then there'll be something more as we progress. But this topic has a lot of considerations. It's more complicated than you might imagine. As we go along, I'm going to just highlight with an asterisk, either black or white. You'll see it in the slides for best practices, which I'll probably also mention. You'll see examples here of good and bad. I'm going to raise a lot of points of consideration, and I'm going to also say up front, not all the solutions are figured out yet. All right, so terminology. There's some key things about terminology, and just for right now, I'm going to say the term accessible trails is an interesting term to look at first, because the Forest Service, whose guidelines we follow to construct accessible trails at DCR, does not recommend the use of the term accessible trails. It's confusing and misleading because so often exceptions are made to allow for the natural environment. And we've seen this in our trails at DCR, where we'll go over the code because the terrain requires that for a short distance, right? But it conflicts with the public's perception that this accessible trail should be super easy. So we're looking for a new term. The Forest Service recommends something that's too much of a mouthful, which is, I have to look at my notes, a trail that complies with the trail accessibility guidelines. That's not going to work in promotion. So terminology is something I have to look closely at. I put all disabilities here because it's easy to think we're serving people with mobility devices primarily, but actually the DCR and the Universal Access Program that I work within, we're serving and looking at the needs of people across the spectrum. And so we have to take that into account for information, for wayfinding. Promotion, how does the public, including people with disabilities, find out about the trail? Whether it's your trail on, town land, or whether it's all the trails nearby, how do they find out about it? And is that in accessible formats? So navigation, for the purposes of my presentation, covers everything from the website to the park to the trail to along the trail and back. So that's everything from downloadable and paper maps to signs and blazing. So how do you unify all that? Trail access information, if that's not a term you've heard before, you're going to find out about it now, and it's very key. Because trail access information, or TAI, is a federal requirement to provide key trail statistics so people can determine whether or not they can hike the trail. So we'll talk about that. Iconography is always something that's part of signage and maps usually, and it can be confusing depending on your cultural background or the lens you're looking at this graphic image through. There's also no standard for trails iconography, so a review process is really important as if you're developing or planning to use iconography for brochures or maps. And then very important, information for wayfinding, for just basic trail information needs to be provided in multiple formats for everyone to be able to access. So that's my nutshell first slide. Whether or not your trails are paved or unpaved, you can help people with disabilities find out about trails on their own through direct outreach. This means putting your materials out into the disability community. It's essential to figure out, to understand what people's needs are. It's essential for design input if you're just starting to build a trail. And it's also essential for wayfinding feedback. Are we doing the right thing, or is there a way we can improve? So in universal access at DCR, it's never finished. Accessibility is never finished. It's always a work in progress. Nature's happening, trails are eroding, you know, it's all up in the air and changing. So we're constantly adapting. You want to get to know your local service organizations in the disability network, develop an outreach list, and get people with disabilities involved from the get-go in the early stages, if that's where you are, because they'll get involved, they'll help spread the word and draw more people to the opportunity. And then it's also really critical that transportation arrangements are acknowledged as something that may be needed in order to ensure access for everybody. So it may not look like it, but this is a universal access program. We're missing the sort of usual mobility gear for the most part, because walking sticks, although a piece of adaptive equipment, are more conventionally, you know, in use by everyone. But this is a hiking program. It's a disability-specific hiking program for people with acquired brain injuries. And we use conventional trails for this, and we learned quickly from participants that, you know, they have needs related to memory, navigation, really tying into that, balance issues often, and also fatigue levels based on the strain of navigating with uneven terrain underfoot. People fatigue more easily. And this is all sort of essential information because they're looking for, and everybody's different with an acquired brain injury, but this is sort of the type of need that people may be looking for, and are we communicating the proper information? So in particular, easy wayfinding is really critical for people with any kind of brain-based injury or disability. So during COVID, I began to assess accessible trails to help promote them for obvious reasons, because everybody was trying to get out there. And so I started with our website, mass.gov. You can just search accessible trails. This will pop up. And I quickly found out that there are wayfinding difficulties from the website to the parks. You can click on these links, get a regional list of accessible trails. You can click on the park, open up the park page, access directions to the park. You might be able to download a map, although not every park has a map. If you get the map, you may or may not find the accessible trail on the map. It may or may not be identified as such. So, you know, I quickly found out that the information starting from this point needs to be unified visually and contextually so that people can start here if that's where they're starting and actually arrive at the park and find the trail. Or if they're just going to the park, can they find the trail? Is the signage appropriate? But what we're going to do here, if you have a website, you want to make sure that it's accessible to people with disabilities, and you want to follow accessibility guidelines for websites. I recommend the W3C, the Worldwide Consortium, Worldwide Web Consortium for Accessible Guidelines. And after my talk, I'll throw these things up in the chat, links that I'm going to refer to. So DCR is planning to make these improvements that I'm telling you are needed, you know, including downloadable maps that are trail specific, accessible trail maps that include information about the trail experience, including significant grades and any obstacles that may be found. So as part of our program, in an adjacent fashion, I maintain a blog called Everyone Outdoors. And here's where I can provide more personal, experiential information for people, easier to read, stories, you know, even guest posts by people with disabilities about their experiences in the parks. And I've circled here my tab on easier trail recommendations. And if you click on that, you'll get a list by region for easier hikes, both accessible trails and easier hikes of longer distances. what I've done, there's no one clearinghouse for, I'm a person with a disability and I want to find out where are the accessible trails near me. Where do I go to find that information? I have to know the landholder's name, find their website and look there. But, it may be a town, it may be a land trust, it may be a conservation area, it may be a state park. There's a variety of these accessible trails and different holdings out there. So what I've done with Everyone Outdoors is create a multi-listing of trails that I've personally assessed. And in that, I can, tell people more directly about what I found for accessibility or the lack thereof. I can describe the highlights. I can give navigation tips. And I can include pictures. If you're doing this for your websites, make sure you provide alternative text. If you don't know how to do that, look that up online. If I can add a link, I will. But it's basically providing a text context for every photograph so that a screen reader can be used to read that photo, at least get the essential info off of it. So during COVID, I went around and I assessed trails and for signage. And of course, the first thing I want to say about signage is that you need to have signage right from the accessible parking area to the trail or whatever other accessible features there are in the park. So getting into the park a little bit further here, I'm in a trail system now, and I did some things to try to improve temporarily until we got better signage to help people understand that, yes, this is the accessible trail. It might look like it to some of us, but some of these trails intersect with others, and you might go down a trail that intersects and it looks accessible at first and then it isn't. So we're trying to avoid people getting into problem areas by providing good wayfinding. And again, this is just temporary signage. At Savoy Mountain State Forest, here's the existing DCR type of trail signage, right? So I put a little indicator that this actually is an accessible trail, at least a portion of it. And I tried to include below, not big enough, just again, this is temporary, some trail access information. And so let's take a closer look at that. But I do want to say in the next slide, but before that, I just want to say, so we are pursuing new signage development at DCR with a grant project. And I'm hoping to influence DCR's upcoming new signage standard with updated information about best inclusive practices. If you're familiar with DCR parks at all, you know that we have complete inconsistency in our signage, how it's done, what it looks like from park to park, even within a park. There's all kinds of issues with signage. And here I am walking into that with a signage project, right, about accessible trails. So you can bet I've opened up a can of worms and I'm having to work with a lot of people to move forward. So looking at trail access information, here's some things to think about. This is for the DAR State Forest, which is the trail behind me in my view here. Again, this is federally required for new and improved trails. At the trailhead, there should be a sign that has trail access information. You want to include the length, the grade, the cross-slope information, the trail width, the surface material, and any information about obstacles. That's kind of the basics that are outlined in the definition of this. So I've done a couple things here. First of all, you want to keep this as simple as possible. And there's a challenge here in the language of the engineers, the designers, and the trail builders, and bringing that into the average person's experience in signage. So for instance, the word tread width would come from engineers or builders, but we would change that to trail width. So, for easier conveyance of information. Icons correlated here come from Beneficial Designs, which is a Nevada-based company that is led by a designer who is paraplegic. They've been around for decades. You can just Google them. Their icons have changed over the years. And so, you know, there's lots of reasons to have confusion about icons, and I'll get back to this with some more examples soon. But this right here, this trail access information, this is what's going to allow people to determine whether they can hike this trail or not. But it does depend on people understanding these concepts, particularly grade and cross slope, and those concepts expressed as percentages. So we can't assume that everybody understands this. And not everybody will use these trail access information signs, but it has to be there for those who need them. So I'm expecting to be providing some education along the way with our materials to help people understand what is a 3% slope. You know, does that matter or not? When does the slope begin to matter for me? So these are key pieces. Some examples from around the country of this type of signage. You kind of have two options, and one is to make your sign just about trail access information. So this is an example of that. And what I'm going to say right off the bat as I look at these samples from many different places is that often the numerical information, the quantitative info that people are looking for is often too small in the context or proportion with the sign or the environment. We're going to see that as we go along. And this may or may not be a good example. Do people even know what tip means? Typical. The typical width of this trail is 5 feet. What does min mean? Does everybody of every cultural background understand the word min, you know, as an abbreviation, you know? So who knows whether this information would convey for everyone, but we're going for universality. This is a close-up view of a trailhead kiosk in New Hampshire, and may need to move some of your Zoom imagery here, but on the right-hand side, there is the trail access information, but it's part of a bigger map, and maybe this has some interpretive elements as well. So now you have this issue of, is the information getting lost? Can people really find it who need it? Either option is acceptable, depending on other factors and needs on site. What I like about this option where they talk about the grade here is how simply and succinctly the grade is represented for the whole trail, the information. We know it's a 7,000-foot trail, 1,500 feet of it is over 5%, and the whole range is 0 to 8%. So now we know this trail is not going over 8%, barring any erosion. And that gives me this really quick nutshell concept of what that trail experience will be like. So this particular version, I think, is a great choice. Here's an example of something that doesn't work so well because, well, it's a lot of technical information. The whole sign is on the left. It's a strip meant for a post or a carcinite post out of plastic or metal or wood. And it's a lot of density of information, and people tend to not pay attention to that. There's a lot of quantitative information. It may not all be necessary. And I can tell you that the people who measured this trail, they did it with the full-blown technological method, which is not in everybody's pocketbook to afford. But so they had all this information. So they put it out there in what might have been a synthesized form, but it's still likely to be a lot to digest for folks. So I would avoid this, but keep it as simple as you can. Here's some samples of some rare DCR trail access information signage. These are earlier icons from Beneficial Designs. Again, the numerical information is minute. And what I want to say about this, I may have said it before, but there are no standards for these types of icons or for outdoor signage accessibility. So our grant project is working towards developing a more informed iconography with input from expert users with disabilities and of different cultural backgrounds. As far as we know, this type of comprehensive input has not taken place. Organizations and agencies seem to be either designing their own wayfinding graphics or borrowing from others, both on a national and international level. Beneficial Designs icons are not in common use, and they've changed a few times. So if you have any confusion about iconography, here's a good reason why. But what we do know is that You Are Here signage is an excellent best practice. These are some test signs that were up at Walden Pond this fall for public feedback. So, we haven't decided yet completely on this, but You Are Here maps are especially good if the top of the map corresponds with the direction of travel. And what this means is as the trail curves and changes direction, the orientation of the map on successive signs is going to change. But that is for best comprehension for the broadest, range of people. Some other things about this map that you see, I tried to blow it up and do an inset. And of course, it's a little blurred, but that's okay because we might have low vision, who knows? The accessible trail is defined with larger dots. This is something DCR does a lot, and it's coming out of the GIS division, and I don't know if we've never really had appropriate feedback on this from all kinds of users. So I'm interested to find out in our survey process, does this really work for everybody? But aside from that, another thing that I like about this is that in orange, when with some solid line, the steeper sections of this trail are identified on the map. And I think that's very useful without complicating it with specific information about that section. So, we just know that's going to be over 5% or 8% or however it might be defined in the trail access information. So these are some good practices. Here's a typical DCR park map. Many of you may be familiar with these. And, one thing I'm going to say, if you are involved in especially paper publications, is to reference the Smithsonian Guidelines for Accessible Publications. That is a 20-year-old document. It's only 11 pages, and it will tell you so much key information about font choice, font size, graphics and background contrasts, to really get to, a really good accessible foundation under your document. What I like about this map is that it shows the accessible trail within large dots as a designation in the legend. That's why I'm going to call that a best practice. And then if you look into the map, you might notice that one trail has enlarged dots. I tried to, again, blow these up and give them as insets on the left, and I left them intentionally blurry as kind of a test. And I will say that this legend should be on a white background for higher contrast with a dark font. For good contrast, you want really a 70% darkness differential between the text and the font, and you don't want to have subtle underlying textures or images underneath the text. I would avoid that if possible. There's also the idea of multiple formats, and this comes into play. So there's a couple of things here. You could have a larger print map. If people are downloading this map, you know, they may or may not be able to enlarge it and keep the detail that you know, you'd hope for. So it's helpful to provide a larger print map, at least upon request, and be available for that request. That's another whole discussion. But another alternate format is an audio tour. So some form of downloadable audio file that can describe the trail experience, use navigation cues, incorporate sounds that might be in the environment. That, a blind person has told me, is his map. Any kind of, you know, tactile map is pretty limited. So, you know, consider multiple formats for maps. And then the other thing is, if you have paper maps, it's really important, if they're in the trail environment or in the park, you need to have them accessible to people with limited mobility. So they should be within the ADA code for accessible reach ranges in terms of height, distance across a counter, that kind of thing. So I'm so excited about this Berkshire Natural Resource Council brochure that's coming out, because it highlights the accessible trails in the Berkshire region. And as far as I know, in Massachusetts, this is the first of its kind, and it's a perfect tool for that disability community outreach. Really highlight those trails and put them in people's hands or on their screens. This is a little snippet of that brochure before it got to its final form. And I bring this up to illustrate, forgive me, Mariah and Mackenzie, the confusion of iconography. So in this earlier version, if you understand what the running slope and the cross slope are, running slope being the grade, the slope in the direction of travel along the trail, and the cross slope being the slant left to right or right to left as you proceed along the trail, as if you were on a hill, for instance. So the icons got turned around in the original layout of this. And it's partly, you know, if you're working with graphic designers, they don't know what this stuff means. So it's easy for them to flip them. The icons themselves might not be clear enough to people looking at them. So, you know, we were able to catch this in a review process. And review processes are very important as you go along developing these materials, even before the initial one comes out. This is an example that I've been playing with over time of a accessible trail specific map and guide. So it'd be an 8.5 by 11 page, two-sided. The map would be on the other side, folds like a brochure. This park only has 2 trails. One's accessible, one isn't. So I tried to really talk about both trails, because some people might want to try a section of the other, or some people with disabilities may be able to hike that inaccessible trail. That's the other thing to keep in mind. So text is very important as a descriptive tool that can be read out loud. It can be read by a screen reader, help people with vision impairments understand the information. I'll make sure I'm including everything here. So the back side is a section of the map. It's actually the whole map, but it doesn't show the legend. And it features the trail access information just for the accessible portion on the upper left. So here what I'm playing with is just black and white and one shade of gray. So really trying to keep the high contrast going. And again, this is a test map. And you can see the need for unified icons, right? You have all these mixed up icons from different sources. So this is one of the things that told me, we have to get our icons in a row here and understandable, and to correlate visually. And you can have too many icons on a map. So what are the most important icons to have? And for other information, how might you indicate it differently? These are all questions that we're looking at. What else about this? It's meant to be that sort of the next level in from the park map, right? Which is going to have some topography. This won't. In this particular one, I was trying to mess around with how can I show those places where the grade is significant or over code. And even on the accessible trail at this park and many others, we've gone over the code to create the system, in part because of the either erosion has happened and created a greater grade, or we had a small section where we were like, if we can, keep this short, a lot of people are going to be able to navigate this and still, many people are coming with other people that make it hand right in the spot. So, how can we at least just indicate, what the grade is? And this is not the answer to have this little number next to a maximum grade icon, right? But it's something, we've been evolving with. And even though, I just will throw in that even though this is a test map, the park involved didn't have a trail map. So they are using this as their trail map right now, so if you build it, they'll use it. Our original accessible hiking icon is on the left. It was designed by a designer over 25 years ago. And, we've used it over the years. We have a whole array of accessible recreation icons for practically every activity you can do in a state park. And they feature this, wheelchair user who is a representative of the international symbol of accessibility, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. Over time, we've used them less, but I have used this icon to, is part of our accessible hiking program. So I adjusted the line quality to indicate a more conventional hiking trail. It wasn't until this year when I had someone from the Institute for Human-Centered Design in Boston, which is an international organization. They have a wayfinding expert, and she looked at this icon and she said to me, that pine tree looks like an arrow. It's something I hadn't thought of. And that's a wayfinding issue, right? Somebody may be interpreting this image differently. So that is, again, why review is important to think about and make happen in the process. I'm getting close to the end here. I just wanted to show a couple of questions from our survey that's about to come out, and hopefully this month. As I mentioned, we're working with the Institute for Human-Centered Design to conduct this survey so we get expert user feedback on wayfinding methods we're developing. This is a sample question, and this we're trying to go after, for one, understanding how are people using the trail systems. How are you using trail maps? What do you use to find your way around? So we're asking some really fundamental questions that we really don't know the answers to, especially as things are changing so much right now with apps. How much are people still needing those paper maps, and all of it. There's other apps out there for navigation people with disabilities use that I'm not even familiar with, so we might be learning some things from this survey. We have a lot of icons and signage examples in the survey, and we want to find out from people, these clickable options, which one best conveys the idea of a grade to you. And this gets really tricky with cross slopes. So we're walking through all the icons and really clarifying, which of these various versions works better. So the one on the left is the designer's icon we're currently working with, with this designer to develop icons for our new signage. And then the other two are existing examples that are out there in use, and there are even others, but we're sort of looking at these three and going, out of these, which are the best? So we're trying to measure what's out there with the designer we're currently using, and giving space in the survey for people to share icons they like better, or color choices, or add comments. So we're hoping to really learn a lot in terms of informing our decisions going forward, because we realize we don't have all the knowledge or all the answers yet. So here we are at the very end. I'm hoping that by January or so, we're going to have the results of that survey. I'm happy to provide any key points we learned to the Berkshire Natural Resource Council to disseminate if you like. Yeah, we want everybody, whether you're alone or with others, to enjoy being able to access all kinds of trails, especially accessible trails. So I think that wraps it up for me.
Awesome.
Thanks for your attention and just interest in this topic. It's so important.
Well, thank you so much, Marcy. I see we already have some interest in those survey results, so folks are excited to see that. Meg, we have a few minutes before we jump into the section on where to find trails. Do you have anything you'd like to add on to that piece of the presentation?
Yeah, I'm so glad that Marcy is doing the survey and actually asking people with disabling conditions what works, because that's a huge part of it. If you have to involve people with a spectrum of disabling conditions in these projects, because they turn out better, far better when you do. Accessibility absolutely starts before somebody gets to your trail. So making the information available online is so important. Love the idea of audio tours, but also pictures or video of the trail. I kind of scour the internet looking for pictures of a new trail before I go, because it helps me determine how navigable it is for me. And I know Marcy kicked off with accessible trail. It can be a tough term. U.S. Forest Service guidelines don't recommend it. I disagree with the Forest Service guidelines on that point, because I think it's important to say something is accessible, because if somebody doesn't say it's accessible, then you start to question whether or not it really is accessible. I would love for them to make a distinction between universally accessible, or an all persons trail, say at like a cap of like a 5% grade, 0 to 5%, and then the 5 to 12, I think 12.5% that the U.S. Forest Service guidelines stipulates you can go up to in terms of a grade or an incline. I think that calling that an accessible trail would be a good compromise there, personally. Yeah, and non-visual signage is so important. We don't have enough non-visual signage on trails. So that's another really important thing that I would love to see more people incorporate as well.
Thank you. Marcy, I noticed in the chat, which is only available to hosts and panelists, but you put in a good resource that I will share in the follow-up email to everyone, so they'll get that. So thanks for sharing, and thanks for your input, Meg. So just keeping with the time, we'll move on pretty quickly. We've got about 10 minutes to just highlight where to find trails. And I think we'll start with Marcy. If you want to talk a little bit more about your Everybody Outdoors blog, that would be great. And then we'll move on to Meg.
Sounds good. Yeah, so you can go there to, and I'll put that in the chat, to look for those easier trail recommendations and find links to a variety of trails. As I said, it's a multi-organization listing. I also highly recommend Mass Audubon. They have a great network of sensory accessible trails in their sanctuaries. And it's really a matter, as I said before, of checking your local town, land trust, conservation areas, some of it's word of mouth, talk to other people about what they've found. There may be, oh gosh, yeah, it needs more support. But that's what I would do.
Thank you so much. Meg, what's your insight?
I agree. It's there is a lot of information that's spread out. On unpavedtrailsforall.org, we do have a trail finder. Mostly Western Mass is populated. We've been gathering information for Central and Eastern Mass, so that's not very populated or really populated at all yet. But I am working on a project that is in development about trying to centralize one place where you could come to find all of the Massachusetts trails. That's something I'm working on in partnership with a couple of other organizations, because it is desperately needed. I spend hours looking for trails. So if I don't know about your trail, there's a problem with the information being available. So, and I would just say to people who are watching this, if you have an accessible trail that's not on the list yet, let me know about it, because we'd love to put it on the list.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. And I'll just quickly share, I'm just going to get my screen ready to be shared. Let's see. Forgive me, I have too many things open at once. All right. Can everyone see that okay? So this is, as Mackenzie shared earlier, a new guide, which is a result of hearing the need to better understand where trails built for barrier-free wheelchair, stroller, and mobility aid access are located in the Berkshires, and really provide the info that folks need to know if it's a good fit for them. I'll just point out that this, we'll scroll up to our partners, this Accessible Trails brochure, this is in draft form, is still being just confirmed and having eyes on by all of our partners, but developed in partnership with Berkshire Family Hikes, the Massachusetts DCR, Unpaved Trails for All, the Great Barrington Land Conservancy, Laurel Hill Association, Berkshire Language Management, and Mass Audubon. It will ultimately also be translated into the Spanish language. So I'll just give you a preview here. There's some great photos, although upside down. I'll just scroll down. So you'll see a lot of what was shared in the conversation today. We're very happy to, and we're very lucky to have the guidance from Meg and Marcy on this resource and our other partners as well. Yeah, so just a sneak peek of that. And then I'll also put in a plug for BNRC's Berkshire County Trails app, or BNRC Berkshire Trails app, I'm sorry, which is a free app that does have a filter that allows you to search accessible trails in and around the Berkshires. And that app doesn't only include BNRC reserves, so a lot of partner trails as well. Mackenzie, I'm not sure if I missed anything along those lines. I'll offer you an opportunity to share if I did.
No, I think that was a great summary. Thank you.
Okay, well, with that, I think we've reached our question and answer time, leaving ample amount of time, and we do have 3 questions in the Q&A already. And I'll also just share, we have, a fairly small enough group. If you want to input your question into the Q&A, that's great. If you also want to virtually raise your hand with the raise hand feature, I can allow you to, or give you the permission to talk and just ask your question out loud. But to get us going, either one of you could answer this question, or both of you. How does one find the disability community to engage with them in the trail planning and design process? How do we know who speaks for or organizes them?
I'm happy to jump in to start that one anyway, and would love, Meg, your support. Every town has a disability commission, and that's a great place to start. It's usually comprised of people with disabilities from that town, and they work with town government and usually meet regularly. I presented at some commission meetings around the state. It's a great way to start to find out, what are the service organizations in this town or this region specifically, which ones might be more actively engaged. Certainly different service organizations may focus in or hone in on different serving people with specific types of disabilities within the spectrum. So you want to make sure you're engaging to find a good range of support services. And usually those, people within those organizations, they may be organizing outings for local folks, or they may be, providing referrals for opportunities as well. But they may be able to also just simply point you to who would be a good person if they aren't exactly that, to help access the community. So that's a really great place to start. In the past, I used to just look in the phone book, when I first started this job, I just opened up the phone book and go, okay, and I'd see a list, it would be listed under, services or something for, human services or whatever. So, you might be able to just start with your own town government.
Yeah, and I would say look for organizations that already deal with accessible recreation or that already are involved with accessible trails. You just want to make sure that when you're reaching out to the community, you're also reaching out to active trail users. Just like a non-accessible trail, you wouldn't ask somebody who doesn't go out on trails their opinion about how well a trail works. So that would be the only thing I would say, is that when you do reach out to those town or municipal or state resources, to make sure that you are connecting with people who are active trail users.
Thank you both. One of our participants input a link into the Q&A. I'm not sure that everyone can see it, but it's mass.gov/commissions-on-disability. And I'll send that around as well.
Great.
That's great. Thank you.
So I'll go on to the next question. And this one is, why not develop some system like ski areas? Blue, green, black with matching shapes for folks with vision problems. The technical percentages are meaningless to anyone without specific training. And Meg, I remember you giving me really good feedback about this when I asked a similar question once.
Yeah, so I liken it to food allergies. If you don't have a food allergy, you probably don't read the ingredients and you probably don't ask what's in something. But if your life depends on it, you ask about it and you look at the labels. And it's the same thing with trails. I know exactly the percentage of grade that my device can do without any assistance. I can do a 12% grade. 12 to 14, I can usually do it on my own, and a 14% grade and above, I would not attempt alone. Because I could get myself into a situation that I can't get myself out of. It is important to provide the information, because people who really need it will look for it and they know what it is. And then, I love using colors and shapes because not everyone can see colors the same way. And shapes is a really good distinction on a map for things that are important to be able to tell apart.
That's great. Marcy, anything to add there?
Yeah, I will say, one of the things we're serving for, I'm a little confused by that question, and you just deleted it, I think, but I'm a little bit confused about, shapes and colors for people with vision issues. I can see where shapes might be more effective for more folks in that category than colors, but in the case of some vision issues, neither one of those things are going to really register. But this brings up an interesting point for me, which is that, trail classification systems, so usually I think of like a ski area as indicating a level of difficulty with those diamonds and everything. And that's a question on our survey. Would you prefer a trail classification system? And there is one that is pretty interesting that exists. I think it's called the spoon system. And it has 1 spoon, 2 spoons, and 3 spoons. And on their site, they define what 1 spoon means, what 2 spoons means, and what 3 spoons mean. It could be stars, it could be anything. And, so it's that difference of, do you provide the information just specifically, or do you have a kind of way of maybe also classifying the trail, easy, moderate, difficult, in the simplest term? But because those are such subjective terms, easy, moderate, and difficult, they almost don't work. But that's why you might go to 3 spoons or stars. I don't know the answer. I'm hoping to find out more from people who respond to the survey, to figure out what really does work best with people. But there is this existing system out there, and I'd love to know what people with disabilities think of that system, and whether it's worth our creating or using that or creating something similar. I spent a lot of time really walking trails and trying to see if I could categorize them. Taking trails within certain measurements, configurations, only so much of a grade, only so much of a trail at so much of a grade, but factoring in the surface and everything else, and trying to see if I could come up with a way of maybe in 5 terms, conveying. And I keep finding trails that go outside of or fill in gaps between those terms that I came up with. So it's very difficult to get a trail to cooperate and be fit within parameters. That's one thing I actually like about trails, but it's a problem for this process.
Yeah. I think the categorization system is interesting. The UK does a really nice job of that, I think, in general. And I think it's a great way to open up trails that are not accessible necessarily to more people, because you're identifying the barriers. And so I like it, but I think you still have to provide the specific information. I don't like easy, moderate, and hard, because what's easy for you may not be easy for me. And it does, Marcy, you're right, become meaningless. The spoons thing is based on a chronic illness thing where, it takes so many, like chronic fatigue and chronic illness, it takes so many spoons. You have so many spoons in a day, and some days getting yourself ready in the morning may take 2 spoons, and some days it may take 4, but you pretty much only have 8 spoons. So you have to figure out how to expend those energy. It's like an energy increment.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. I do think that, not everybody's going to understand percentages, and there is a little bit of, for instance, somebody whose grandmother is using a wheelchair, right? They just may not be as familiar with the use of wheelchair until later in life, and the percentage thing just may not make sense at that point. I don't know. I'm just throwing this out as an example, but I think a little bit of education in the materials, whether it's we're playing around with the idea of a QR code or some way of accessing an online legend, so you're not eating up a paper document with a lot of explanation, but you could kind of on site with your phone, if you have cell reception, you might be able to quickly look at an online page and understand, oh, okay, 8.3% is a standard wheelchair accessible ramp. Now I understand that 12% might be hard, but maybe I can do 5%, no problem. Reference points. So we're kind of looking at that as a possible solution too.
Thank you both. One of our participants, Ted Chapman, has raised their hand, so I'm going to allow them to talk real quick.
Hi, I'm Ted Chapman. I'm from Newton, Mass, and Newton just created a Trails Commission to try to coordinate all of this information among the various trails and conservation areas and parks and so forth. And this is so much rich information. I'm just so appreciative of everyone's sharing this. I had a very basic question, Meg, for you about when you talk about soft surfaces, what that means. I know, the Parks and Recreation people, as we're building trails, we're definitely looking at porous surfaces, stabilized stone dust, as opposed to regular stone dust because of the erosion issues and the expense of maintenance. Can you talk a little bit about that criteria and how important it is to have a soft surface?
Yeah, I mean, I think all accessible trails are beneficial and important. I just don't think we have enough soft surface accessible trails. I think the default is often pavement, and I think everybody can kind of in their own personal experience recognize the difference between a natural space, something that feels really integrated into the environment versus something that feels sort of constructed into the environment a little bit more, which is pavement feels to me, less natural and more constructed. So compacted stone dust for sure, stabilized stone dust. Gravel is problematic. When you get to a standard
Sure.
size gravel, it can't be compacted well. And it's also a tire popping hazard for some devices.
Yeah.
And one popped tire can really be a problem on a trail. Believe me, I have found that out. And so yeah, I think there's even some, it depends on the soil structure certainly, but even some stabilized soils. I know there's some experimentation going on with things like a plastic grid material and soil or grass, but those are very new, and I would encourage people to test those out a little bit more. I don't have a lot of experience with those, and I don't think many people do. And before you build an entire trail with one of those, I would say test it on a small scale, maybe.
And in terms of people who have vision limitations, we just built a trail or restored a trail that we use white stabilized stone dust, so it's bright.
Mhm.
And then we, along the sides, we put a river stone barrier,
Mhm.
so that it's a tactile differentiation for people. How important are those things? I mean, for normal trail construction, the color of the surface material and the edge effects, if you can
Yeah,
afford it.
that's a great question. I think edges are helpful and important for non-visual navigation. It's interesting. I haven't really considered the color of the stone dust before. That's a really interesting thing to consider. And I think it probably still feels really natural and integrated into the environment, but it's a really, really interesting thing that I'd be curious about myself. But yeah, edging is certainly a helpful navigation tool. That tactile difference can be important, I think.
Just for people with visual impairments, or even if you're on a wheelchair or a
Well, it's funny that you bring it up. I would say mostly visual blindness and low vision folks, it's probably the most important. But I was actually just out on a trail last week and all the leaves had come down. And if I wasn't familiar with the trail, I actually wouldn't have been able to see where it was. And using a mobility device in that sort of situation, if you go off of an edge of a trail, you can get yourself stuck. So before last week, I would have said not such an important factor, but actually for the first time in a decade, I thought, wow, I have no idea where this trail is if I didn't know it. So
Well, thank you all.
Great. Should we go to the next question, or Marcy, did you have anything to add to Meg's responses?
It'd probably be too involved. I think Meg, you did a great job.
Yeah.
Just that, like the trail behind me, is stone dust of different stones of different sizes layered in with compacted stone dust on top, and a psyllium-based product was used to stabilize it. That trail's been out there for, over 25 years and occasionally needs some maintenance, more so recently with climate change, heavier water events or rain events. But, they do require some maintenance from time to time, but it seems like overall, if it's well built with a good underlying foundation, it will last a long time.
Yeah. Okay, well, we have time for one last question. So I will pose the next one that came in, which is there a recommended icon for accessible parking near trails, or a better term than handicapped parking?
Yeah, I'm going to just shoot this one real quick. We use accessible parking instead of handicap parking. Yes, it's great you just work the word handicapped right out of the language everywhere. The icon is kind of interesting. So as I'm not the code person in our program at DCR in terms of ADA requirements, but what's required there is the striping at the parking spot with the access aisle and a sign in a post in the center of the parking space at the head of it. The painted icon on the parking space is not required. So, however, there's a really important stipulation that it is the ISA icon that must be used for parking spots, in the built environment. So if you're in a parking lot or, in the more rural environments, it's a little more ambiguous, but it's still if you're defining the parking spot as an accessible parking spot, it's the sign. It's not the icon that's painted on the in the spot. So if it's on pavement, often you'll see those painted icons, and some communities are using the newer active wheelchair icon, which is an interesting icon all by itself to talk about. But it is something that if you use it for the signage in parking, you are actually violating, the federal codes, because it needs to be that ISA standard icon. But you see a lot of communities painting the space with the active wheelchair icon. So, so it's an interesting question, because there's some good things to think about here. So when in doubt, use the official ADA accessibility icon, the person in the wheelchair with the kind of doorknob head. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you. Meg, do you have any last words along the lines for that question before we wrap up?
Yeah, accessible parking, I agree. Handicap is a word that can be offensive to a lot of people. So just doing your research about inclusive language. We have an inclusive language tab on our website. You can Google search inclusive language. It's just, words matter. It's one of those really important things. And yeah, just making sure that whether it's paved or unpaved parking, that there is accessible parking and that it's signed, and that the surface is accessible. A lot of times people will do a gravel parking lot and then an accessible surface trail, and you have to get from the parking lot to the trail, and the gravel can be a problem. So that's something I'm going to throw in. It's a little bit off our topic, but important.
Yeah, thank you. Well, in the event of finishing on time, I just wanted to thank both of our speakers, Meg and Marcy. Thank all the participants for joining, whether now or watching the recording. We will send a follow-up email with the recording and resources, many that were mentioned by both participants and presenters. And I'll also share that any unanswered questions can go through BNRC. So my contact will be in that follow-up email as well, and we'd be happy to help lend a hand in that regard. Any last words from other co-hosts and panelists?
There was a question about planning, design, and building process for accessible trails, and we're going to cover a lot of that in the next, in the winter session on accessible trails. So just a reminder to folks that this is the first of a two-part series, and stay tuned for more information about that next event.
Yes, we'll be sure to include anyone who RSVP'd, anyone's email. It'll be on an email list for the next one as well. So keep an eye out. All right. Well, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.